In almost all of our previous lectures, we've been talking about writers who came either from the aristocracy or very closely connected with the aristocracy. In the case of Pushkin, of course, someone who moved in the very highest circles of the Russian aristocracy. In the case of Tolstoy and Turgenev, people who had large estates and who had a very great sense of independence because of the estates and the positions they held. Gogol and Dostoevsky, of course, well, Gogol came from the aristocracy, although from a rather petty part of the aristocracy. Dostoevsky's father was a doctor, although later on he was made an aristocrat of some small significance. So that all of these people were closely connected with the aristocracy. Chekhov was the grandson of a serf, but of course the serfs were very closely connected with the aristocracy since they did the labor on the estates. So all of them had a very good sense of what the very highest class of Russian culture had to offer and in what way they related to that highest class. Now we're coming to a very different kind of a figure who was born among the so-called mieszczaństwo, that is, the petty artisans and commercial people. His grandfather, the one we're talking about, took the pseudonym of Gorky. His real name was Pieshkov. His father married into a family called the Kashirins, who had a dye shop in the old city of Nizhny Novgorod, a very important city in Russia before the revolution. As a matter of fact, the young man who took the name of Gorky became so important in the Soviet period that the city was renamed in his honor. And for a large part of Soviet history, the old city of Nizhny Novgorod, which today, of course, is by the same name, in Soviet times was called Gorky. It became a kind of a Soviet Detroit, an important center for the production of automobiles, and of course during World War II also of military vehicles and tanks. His real name was Alexei Maximovich Pieshkov. His father was very proud to be a Pieshkov and not a part of what they considered this petty materialist or vulgarly materialist family called the Kashirins. But he grew up in the family, he grew up in the city of Nizhny Novgorod in the house that had the shop of a cloth dyer. Very, very early on, Gorky's father, Pieshkov, who didn't get along with the family, eloped with the mother and went all the way down the Volga for well over 1,000 miles to the colorful city of Astrakhan. But while the father was there, he died of cholera. Cholera, as a matter of fact, with which he was infected because of his infant sons also being sick with cholera. The son recovered, but the father died from the cholera. And the mother never quite forgave the son. She thought that he was in some sense responsible for the death of her husband, the death of the father. So one of Gorky's first memory is of the burial of his father. What he remembered was the frogs who jumped into the grave rather than the father. Then he was brought by his grandmother Akulina on a long, long trip up the Volga, back from Astrakhan all the way up to Nizhny Novgorod. This was something that Gorky never forgot. In contrast to the coldness of his mother, what he remembered was the extraordinary warmth of his grandmother, an old woman who was illiterate at that time. Well, she was typical of the class of people from which she came. She was not illiterate because she was ignorant. She was illiterate because nobody had ever given her an education. But to make up for this, she had a colossal memory, and she managed to remember thousands of lines from Russian folklore, which he remembered on that trip back up the Volga. She had the people on the ship absolutely mesmerized by her telling all of those tales from Russian folklore. Her natural talent was at least as powerful as that of her grandson, who later acquired a worldwide reputation as an author. Gorky had to leave the house at an early age. He never felt quite at home in the house of his grandfather. He was very proud of the fact that he was a Pieshkov, whereas these people were Kashirins, and all of the terrible money-grubbing aspects of life that they were so tightly connected with was something that was alien to him even as a very young child. So that just as soon as he could, he left the household and got jobs in various places throughout Russia. He acquired a wide knowledge of many, many different parts of that huge country, not least of them as a cook's assistant on a Volga steamship. Of course, on that Volga steamship, he met all kinds of people and visited all kinds of places over the vast territory of European Russia. He first managed to attract a wide reputation in the 1890s as a writer of short stories about people called in Russian bosyaki, that is literally barefooted people, who wanted about the land and exhibited, at least the way Gorky presented them, a fierce sense of individual independence and strong will. Some of these stories pictured extraordinarily strong people, both men and women, who seemed to the Russian reading public a class of people entirely different from what they'd encountered previously in literature. These stories made a tremendous impression on the Russian reading public. As a matter of fact, they impressed Lev Tolstoy himself, who made the statement that Gorky made the people feel the spirit of the ordinary Russian people in a way that no other author, including even himself Tolstoy, had been unable to do. This was high praise, of course, from the writer of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, so that Gorky attracted a wide readership with these very colorful characters whom he presented in these stories. Mind you, there were some people who didn't like it very much. They felt that this was bringing Russian literature down, that this was bringing it down from that wonderful aristocratic level of high culture to the vulgar low culture of the ordinary people. But of course, the kind of force that Gorky managed to bring into the language, into the psychology of these characters, was very impressive to those who genuinely liked literature. Then, in 1902, or shortly before 1902, Gorky wrote a play that was destined to become a very famous play throughout the world. In English, it's usually translated as The Lower Depths, although in Russian, literally, it's Na dnie, which means on the bottom. The play deals with the theme of the life-giving illusion as opposed to the death-dealing reality of actual life. And as a matter of fact, the play comes out in favor of the illusion and against those facts from everyday life which bring people down and rob people of hope that they might otherwise have in the society as Gorky saw it in the late days of the Tsar. As a matter of fact, the American playwright Eugene O'Neill wrote a play called The Iceman Cometh, which is taken directly from Gorky's famous play, where in many ways he makes exactly the same point. You might, as a matter of fact, argue that Gorky in this play was actually arguing for lies rather than for truth, and of course many of the critics who were hostile to him brought that out very strongly. But this play was produced by the Moscow Art Theater, about whom we talked in the lectures about Chekhov. The art of Stanislavski, the art of that theater, was so powerful that this play made an enormous impression, first of all in Petersburg and Moscow, and later on throughout the West and even coming to America. It made for Gorky an international reputation. He became a kind of international celebrity, which at least for a few years in the early 20th century even went beyond that of Tolstoy himself. Gorky became a kind of well, one might almost say a Hollywood star before the time of Hollywood, a celebrity in his time. And of course, his growing reputation attracted interest throughout Russia, most especially among the growing force of the revolutionaries of that time, who saw in him a natural ally representing the lower part of Russian society, the lower classes, on the basis of whose aspirations and work they were trying to bring about a revolution. It was hardly surprising that he attracted the attention of the radical revolutionaries who were trying to overthrow the Tsarist regime itself. And this was a time when the Russian Marxists had split into two factions, and a man named Lenin was recognized as the head of the Bolshevik faction. Bolshevik literally means the people of the majority in Russian, as opposed to the Mensheviks, who wanted a somewhat milder form of revolution. They wanted a revolution which would come about by parliamentary means. Lenin insisted on a revolution which would be brought about by violent action. And as a matter of fact, in 1905, the Bolsheviks managed an uprising in Russia, which at least for a short time managed to seize power in Petersburg and Moscow. It didn't last for very long, and of course it was put down with considerable violence by the Tsarist forces. But nevertheless, this revolution was seen as a kind of a precursor of what was going to happen later on. As a result of this revolution, Gorky left the country, and there was an episode where he actually came to the United States in order to raise funds for the Russian revolutionaries. Lenin, of course, was happy to see him coming to America, hoping to get support from this country for the revolution that he hoped would be coming, and as a matter of fact, which did come, something like 16 or 17 years after these events. People in America saw this as Russian democratic reformers trying to overthrow a tyrannical Tsarist regime, and so a committee was formed to meet the famous Russian writer. The head of this committee was none other than Mark Twain himself. And when Gorky actually got off the ship and came into New York, there were tremendously respectful interviews. They said, "Mr. Gorky, do you think a revolution will take place in Russia? Mr. Gorky, do you think Russia will be a democracy?" He was lionized tremendously by this committee. When the Tsarist diplomats in Washington saw what was happening, they got kind of worried. They certainly did not like the idea of Gorky going among socialists in America or liberals in America trying to raise money for a Russian revolution, and they tried to figure out some way that they could possibly abort this mission of Gorky's. And of course, Gorky made a move which allowed them to make, from their point of view, a brilliant stroke. Gorky made the mistake of signing an exclusive agreement with the Hearst newspapers to write his impressions of America, which he would see as he was traveling around the country. It was also the case that he was traveling with a woman from the Moscow Art Theater, Madame Andreeva, who was his common-law wife. In Russia at that time, there was no such thing as a divorce, or as an official divorce, and Gorky, like many other people, had left his first wife and was simply attached to this woman as in an arrangement which we would call the common-law wife. It was really a marriage arrangement in spite of the fact that there had been no divorce. Well, the Russian diplomats saw here a tremendous opportunity. They let the other newspapers know. Of course, the other newspapers were quite angry that Hearst had gotten a jump on them and gotten Gorky to make an exclusive for them. So they were very happy to print in their newspapers the news that the Russian embassy, the Tsarist Russian diplomats had given them, that Gorky was traveling with a woman who was not his lawfully wedded wife. The headlines were splashed large all over the New York papers, and of course all of New York was terribly afraid that Gorky was traveling with this woman was going to destroy the famously high moral level of family life in New York at that time. It was not one of the more glorious chapters of American cultural life. The result of this was that Gorky and his common-law wife, Madame Andreeva, were expelled from the hotel late in the evening into a city where he didn't know the language, and of course he had no idea where to turn. You can imagine the desperate situation in which he found himself. I'm embarrassed to say I like Mark Twain very much, and I'm embarrassed to say that Mark Twain, as soon as he heard this story, ran out on Gorky just as fast as he could and took himself as far away from the situation as he possibly could. The only one who took Gorky in was a young professor named John Dewey at Columbia University. Those of you who know something about American philosophy know that Dewey later became one of our most eminent philosophers. It was John Dewey who took the couple in. As I said before, it was not one of the outstandingly noble moments in American literary history. Gorky did manage to speak before some socialist groups at the time, but his notions about American democracy and American decency, as you might imagine, were not very high. As a matter of fact, later on, when he cooled off a bit, Lenin himself told Gorky, he said, "Look, you should have been better informed about American customs before you visited the country." Gorky, as a matter of fact, did write a story about New York called City of the Golden Devil, or City of the Yellow Devil, where he portrayed the city as a place where every night people dug up a pile of gold and buried it somewhere else, and everyone in the city spent all day running around breathlessly trying to find that pile of gold, only unsuccessfully to go to sleep that night, and the gold would be moved again. I must say, it's not entirely unlike the impressions of someone who comes to New York for the first time, even if he hadn't been through the experiences of Gorky. But in any case, while he was here, he wrote one of the most famous revolutionary novels, a novel called Mother, before returning to Europe, where he settled on the Italian island of Capri, where he lived until 1913, that is roughly from 1906 or 1907 to 1913. In those years, most of the Russian revolutionaries were in exile, in emigration, and there were enormous polemics which went on among them. Gorky played the role of a maverick among the Bolsheviks, which Lenin found not very easy to control. There was a time where he got involved in a movement called the God Builders. He regarded Christianity as something that was God-seeking. He said, "We Bolsheviks will not seek God, we will build God, and our God will control human destiny and human society in a way that will be good for all classes of people."